Currently, in most denominations, the people of color are paying the most to be there. And so the conversation we're trying to have is, why don't we share the expense a little more? Now, we shouldn't be the
when you say share the expense, you mean just giving up all of our cultural norms.
What does it cost you? What does it cost you lately to pursue multi-ethnicity? Now, you ask a person of color like me or some of the others, they will tell you years. They have received, all sorts of costs. I would ask the local senior pastor, what has it cost you lately to lean into this? Some would answer, hey, we've done this, it's currently costing me this, great. Others would go, dang, it hasn't cost me a thing in a while, right?
You're listening to the Ferment podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is Geno Olison. Geno is the co-lead pastor of the South Suburban Vineyard in Flossmoor, Illinois. He also leads the diversity initiative for Vineyard USA. This episode is brought to you by Monk Drums. Monk Drums is a creative desert venture that strives to combine beauty and business as one heartbeat. Monk Drums' main focus is handcrafted wooden drums that allow us to love, assist, and serve all who accompany us on this path. Use the coupon code FERMENTPOD to get 5% off your Monk Drums order. Find them on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Monk Drums, and every Monday look for hashtag Monk Drum Monday. Speaking from personal experience, monk drums are wonderfully crafted and they sound amazing. They blend the best traits of both the djembe and the cajon, and I found them to be incredibly versatile in both the live and studio environment. Check them out at monkdrums.com.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at worshipteam.com. Worshipteam.com comes preloaded with over 12,000 songs, with new songs being added all the time. Hillsong, Bethel, Vineyard, Six Steps, Jesus Culture, just to name a few. Service building with Worship Team is a snap, and all the songs are completely legal and licensed. You can also find them on social media, Facebook at worshipteam.com, Twitter at worshipteam, Instagram at worshipteam_WT. Visit them at worshipteam.com for a free trial today. Complete worship planning with thousands of songs, easy interface, mobile apps, and legal rights for your church. All you need in one place, worshipteam.com. Hi everyone, this is Melissa Keller, Director of Events and Project Management for Vineyard Worship. We release a new single on the first Friday of every month. Our latest single, God of Our Mothers and Fathers, is a powerful prophetic word for the church at this moment, featuring the raw, magnetic voice of Samuel Lane.
God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. Come take the vineyard you planted and make us new wine. God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. Come take the vineyard you planted and make us new wine. Oh Lord.
Find God of our mothers and fathers and all of our singles wherever you listen to music.
Hey, what up, everybody? I'm in the south suburbs of Chicago. I'm in Flossmoor. Is that right, Geno?
That's right.
Yeah, I'm with my friend Geno Olison, and I'm in your church.
Yep.
And I'm jealous. I already told you that.
That's okay.
Yeah, because
It's a good jealous.
It is a good jealous. You guys have recently acquired this place.
Yep.
You were renting it before, but
Yeah,
now
we
it's
rented
yours.
this place for 8 years, old Jewish community center.
Yeah, no, I'm just doing that thing because we're in a spot where we need a bit more square footage, and you guys you've made the leap. So, Pastor Jealousy, it's here.
That's okay, man.
That's not what we're going to talk about, though. I want to talk to Geno because he is a pastor, songwriter, musician. You're a drummer. Do you ever lead worship, Geno?
I do.
Yeah. You got kids. You got a wife. You're a regional and national leader in the Vineyard movement. You're all these things. And I just think you have a unique perspective that we need to hear from. Yeah. And we'll get to that. But I thought we should just do the thing we always do here and do a little personal history and figure out where you're from. Where'd you live?
Yeah, I grew up about 40 minutes north of here on the south side of Chicago. I grew up around 48th in Indiana, not too far from where the White Sox play baseball. And so
I drove past that this morning.
Yes, I grew up in that community. I have 7 sisters. And my parents raised us on the south side. My parents, before they came to know the Lord and eventually became pastors, were career criminals, man. So they ran the streets.
Really?
My father was a professional stick-up artist, was into drug dealing, and he was a pimp, the whole deal. And my mother was his partner in crime. And so by the time we started to come along, my earliest memories growing up, my mom would take us to this Baptist church around the corner from our house.
How old were you?
I would place myself around 4 or 5 in my memories.
Yeah.
Old.
So had they gotten saved by then? Or was it sort of like this is a work in progress?
Before I did some digging, I thought so, but apparently my father wasn't, because now that I think about it, my father never went to that church. The old Ship of Zion Missionary Baptist Church around the corner. My father never went to that church. In fact, now I understand that he was still getting high and doing all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so my dad was watching the Liberty Hour on TV.
What's the Liberty Hour?
The Liberty Hour is a weekly broadcast from the church that we eventually started going to. Pastor Turner was on television, and my father said he would get high and watch preaching on the TV.
Yeah.
And so one night, like, he got saved through the TV, through watching Pastor Turner on the TV. And from that point on, he started taking us, and we had to take 2 buses and a train to get all the way to this church, which is
a big family.
Yeah, it was, it was 7 of us, living in the house. And so we would take, and it wasn't just like a Sunday deal. It was like 2-3 services throughout the week. My father he was the type of guy that whatever he did it to the max, right? When he got saved,
I'm not just gonna rob or stick a few people up. I'm gonna stick everybody up, right?
And so when he came to faith, it was the same, all in. And so we stopped going to the Baptist church, and all of us started going with my father to Liberty Temple Full Gospel Church, which is where we eventually became members. My parents became leaders, and eventually they were sent out to plant their own church.
Wow.
And
so that was formational for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was, how old were you when that was going on?
So I would say around, again, my memory's a little fuzzy. My mom says they're celebrating 30 years this summer.
Yeah.
So probably 7.
Yeah.
I was 7.
Yeah. Are those good memories?
Those are great memories.
Yeah.
Those great memories because when church is all I knew.
Yeah.
Church is all I knew. It really is all I knew, man. Growing up, going to church, like I said, 3-4 services every week. And I didn't love church. I liked it. I certainly didn't mind it. I grew up with a lot of kids who would grumble about going to church, but I liked it. And I especially love the music. The worship team was called the Sanctified Band. And these guys were serious musicians, man. In fact, they were some of the leading, Pastor Turner's church in the Sanctified Band was one of the first churches to do contemporary worship that included like praise teams versus, say, just choirs.
Yeah.
And so they were in the leading edge of, causing other churches to switch to having praise teams and really, really solid bands. Pastor Turner was very instrumental in doing that in the city of Chicago.
Was Pastor Turner, was he a musician?
He was not. He was a very good singer, though.
Yeah.
And so you had a real treat if your preacher could sing and preach.
Yeah.
Pastor Turner could sing and preach. I mean, that made the service going to be longer because the praise team would do their thing and, he would get tuned up too. But I would watch these guys play. And I think this was sort of the beginning of the musical formation to me. I would watch these guys play. Pastor Charles, he would play at the lead guitar, but he was also a really good singer. Stephanie and Malcolm on the drums. I would just be mesmerized during worship because these guys were so good. And when we planted our church, we had no such musicians. So we had.
You're talking about when your mom and dad
When
planted
my
their
mom
church.
and dad planted.
Where did they plant?
They planted 2 blocks from our house in the YMCA.
Oh.
So our church literally was down the street. Sometimes we walked there. And in those early days, we played cassettes.
Yeah.
We played cassettes, and guess who was the worship leader? I was the sound guy.
Yeah.
So how it worked is, we had the cassettes, Ron Canoli, Fred Hammond, any music we wanted, we could play because we played the cassettes. And as we got a little bit more money, we got 2 cassette decks, and I was queuing up the next tape.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm ready for you.
And then when we got these dual CD decks.
Yeah.
And so my mom would lead the worship, and we wouldn't necessarily plan the sets before. Maybe she would say, hey, I want to do this song. But the worship set and flow was totally up to me. So I had these cases of CDs, and however the Spirit would move, we would just crossfade into the next one, and worship was just be electric.
That's hilarious, man. So that makes me think, or this brings up another question in my mind. So your mom and dad, they get saved off of the streets, and they start going to this amazing church, Sanctified Band. Did they stay in the neighborhood? When they got saved, did they live in the same place?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so your dad was like this gangbanger guy, and he gets saved, but he's living in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, my father didn't necessarily like gangs because he didn't like the sort of follower mentality, but he had a lot of street credit.
Yeah.
Nobody ever messed with us. In fact, his friends for the longest time thought this preaching was like a racket. They thought this is another hustler angle for him,
That's so good. So it took the neighborhood a while to figure out what is it that your dad is doing.
It took his buddies a while to figure out it wasn't just a racket, but this was my father died a year after we planted this church. And
you're talking about the church you planted.
This church, yeah. And so, it's really sad that he didn't get to see all this because he was just so proud that I was in ministry.
Oh, he would love this, right?
Oh, he would absolutely love this, man.
Yeah. So what was church like as you got older? Like you were like running the CD faders and stuff. Did you guys eventually get a band?
Not before I left for college. But I just think we had perfected that, right? And so, we didn't have any musicians. Every now and then a musician would come in, but the CD thing worked.
Yeah.
And I think they're still doing that to this day. They just perfected it. It's just it's smooth. It works, and the Spirit falls into place every time they gather. But I feel like I had to be so familiar with the music, and I would just go to the Moody Christian bookstore back when they sold CDs, and I would just. It was like Christmas when a new CD came out, And so I just poured over music and got involved in music. I didn't go anywhere without my headphones on.
Yeah.
And so
Did you have a Walkman?
I had the yellow Walkman with the sport one, nice headphones, and I was constantly listening to music. And in our faith context, secular music was bad. So I didn't listen. We weren't allowed to listen to secular music.
So you went deep on the gospel side.
Super deep. And it wasn't just gospel. It was kind of strange because as a black kid growing up on the South Side, I was listening to Stephen Curtis Chapman, B.J. Thomas, Russ Taff. I just had this really eclectic, And I think before I even heard of Vineyard, we played some Vineyard stuff, which kind of turned some heads when you would play,
Yeah.
because I would work in some Darlene Check, back
Yeah.
when Shout to the Lord came out, and the Hungry record with
Yeah.
Breathe on it,
Yeah.
then Michael W. Smith cut some of those tunes.
Yes.
And I had worked some of those tunes, and some of the tunes, like, they were like, don't play those songs again. But the Breathe worked, and some of the other Vineyard tunes worked. And so I just had I was drawn to a lot of these different styles of music from the very beginning.
Okay, so that explains a lot to me. It explains to me why anytime I hang out with you, like if there's a record mentioned, you know who the drummer is, you know who the bass player is, you know who produced it.
I would read the cassette covers.
Yeah, you were reading the liner notes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
always.
you're one of these. You're a muso in that world. You know that whole world.
Mhm.
That's very cool. Yeah. So you grow up, but I know you're a pastor now. Did you think you were going to be a pastor?
I didn't think I was going to be a pastor. Correction. I didn't think I was going to be a church planter or a lead pastor. I strongly entertained the possibility of me doing something in ministry, but I went to school. I went to school for television,
Yeah.
and I was
Like to be on television
or
to be in the back?
to be on the technical side.
Yeah.
And so in college, I was a part of the television production sequence. Later switched to just general communications, but during college, I got a job at WICD, which is the NBC affiliate station in Champaign, Illinois. And I started as a cameraman, floor director, and worked my way up to technical director, which in that market, you're not only switching the show at the board, but you're actually directing the show. You're both technical director and director. And so, but I also learned that if you want to move up in TV, you have to move all around the country. And so
Yeah, you have to go chase those opening positions wherever they're at.
So just to back up a little bit, so when I graduated from high school in 1999, I should also mention that my entire social network was exclusively African American.
Okay.
We lived in a Black neighborhood, went to Black schools, Black churches, the whole deal. We didn't have any meaningful interactions with people who weren't Black, with very, very few exceptions. That was just the nature of.
So in high school, you didn't have any white friends?
No.
Yeah.
No.
That's amazing.
There might be one or two mixed kids in school, but our school was practically 100%.
Yeah.
The student body, African American.
Yeah.
With very few exceptions.
Yeah. So then you get this TV production degree and you go to Champaign.
I go to Champaign.
You're in another world, right?
It's a total culture shock for me. Because it's just such a overwhelmingly white space.
Yeah.
Now, a college campus like that is known for its international student body.
Yeah.
But it's overwhelmingly white, the student body. And so it wasn't uncommon for me to be the only African-American student in many of my classes and many settings as well, too.
How did that feel to you?
It was a little more than a little disorienting, man, because if you don't have meaningful interactions with people, you just don't know how they perceive you. You have to understand, too, growing up as a Black kid on the South Side, we're in the Chicago public school system, which is a very Afrocentric education.
Yeah.
You read the history books, right? And my parents grew up in the South, so they grew up in the South at a time where, folks weren't kind to people who looked like us.
That's right.
And so the social education I got from them was, you watch out for those white folks. Yeah. It was, hey, you can't trust them. And although it wasn't explicitly teaching me to hate white people, it was definitely, I grew up I was socialized to not trust them. I was socialized to think of them as people who couldn't be trusted and people who did not like me, right? Yeah. And so when you get to an environment like the University of Illinois at Champaign, you just kind of process a lot.
It's like farm country.
Well, I mean,
bit too,
it is in the surrounding, but it feels, the actual vibe of the city feels a lot like this, where we are now, minus the huge college town. But there's so many white people that you had to interact with for the very first time. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, what do they think of me? We're very different. We have different tastes. I mean, you're on a dorm floor all of a sudden with all these different kinds of people. and it's just a lot to process. Like when you're in your native space, somebody once said, hey, what's understood doesn't have to be spoken, right? There's so much shared context that you just have the ability to exist, right? But when you're a fish out of water like that, you're constantly processing and trying to figure out what's what.
Geno, did you feel isolated or alone? Was it lonely or not?
If I did feel a bit isolated, mainly because the path that, now it makes sense. The path that the Lord seemed to be forcing me to take was a path that wasn't. So it was very typical for an African-American or Asian or Latino student to find these little pockets of Blackness or Asianness or Latino-ness, right? And plug into those groups. And so you had some solidarity within those groups. It seemed for me like the Lord was leading me intentionally and uncomfortably to spaces that were not native to me, right? And so, for example, I, started going to a small group through InterVarsity, and going to their small groups and going to their large group meetings. I was easily one of two, sometimes the only African American in those meetings, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, it makes sense now given what the type of ministry that we do. But I was getting a social education at that school that I value more than my the academic education I got. And basically what the Lord seemed to be doing was, teaching me how to value different kind of people.
Yeah.
And that was just hard, man. It was hard. You say lonely, I guess that's a way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
It was all of that.
I remember college or whatever, because I didn't live on campus, but I understand those scenarios. And gosh, in college is like, it's when you're supposed to make the best friends of your life, or, music and events are such a big part of college. And then all of a sudden you're sort of like inundated in an environment that's very different than your own, right? So you kind of are thrown into the deep end of the pool of getting a new social education.
Yeah. And that actually turned out to be a really good thing, despite it being very awkward and uncomfortable, because I feel like the greatest gift the Lord gave me as far as my future and my calling was concerned was he gave me friends from those different kinds of people.
Yeah.
And so I think about Andy Campbell and I think about Steve Rockerman, who are guys that I met in InterVarsity, and those guys became my best friends. Again, we were very different, but we became friends. And all of a sudden, in becoming friends with these guys, a couple of things happen. One, you start to like them, and actually your deepest friends, you actually start to love these guys.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, before, you didn't really know any white people like that. And so white people were just kind of this clump of people, right? With all of the historical baggage and all of the mistrust and all of that. But when you start to get to know some people, then all of a sudden, broad sweeping generalizations that used to ring true, all of a sudden they don't ring as true. And even like racist statements and jokes that used to be really funny, all of a sudden they seem so inappropriate because you know somebody now. Like you say, all white people do this and all white people are this. And it gives you pause because you go, well, wait, I know Steve now. Like before I didn't know Steve, I would agree with you. That rang true. But now I know Steve and I know Andy and I know Chris, and those guys aren't like this. So, a lot of them might be that way, but no longer was the sweeping like statements true anymore.
That's something I've also realized in my own life. It's really hard to hate people, It's hard to demonize people, And so in order to do those kind of things, you actually have to make distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know this has been something that's happened in my life a ton of times, like growing up, in lots of different ways. You would learn or you'd be socialized to understand life one way, or you would think about a group of people, oh, well, they're this, or those people are this. And then invariably you make a friend and then you go, it's just exactly what you're saying. You're like, I don't know if I don't know what to do about this now. Yeah.
Well, the first stage of that is you make exceptions for those people. So that's kind of problematic in a sense, because you go, yeah, I think, Black people are this, but Geno, I like him. Rather than changing what I think about that people group, I'm just going to make an exception for you. I'll just say, you're cool. And people actually said it to me, man, like, you're all right. You know, we like you. You're cool for Black. Maybe they don't say you're cool for a Black guy. They say, hey, we like you. And that's code for.
That could be the subtext.
Hey, we've made an exception for you versus letting this real life person who disproves everything that I once thought change my opinion of an entire people group. I'm just going to sort of make an exception. So that's the first stage. But as you wade deeper into that, which through the leading of the Spirit, it's like, just taught on, Philip going to Cornelius and how the Spirit leads us into these situations that are life-changing. The Spirit was leading me into these places and these amazing discoveries, man.
And that's one of the main themes through the whole book of Acts.
It is.
It starts in Acts chapter 2, right?
Sure.
Like the Spirit comes, people speak in tongues, and it's all the languages, right? And from there, the Spirit keeps leading people out of their regular group or their home group into a place where they don't know.
But that's the challenging part right now, particularly as we talk about multi-ethnicity in the Vineyard. It's just too often the case that the people of color have to leave their native spaces and get comfortable someplace else. When this really will start to cook is when our white brothers and sisters will be the one who are like Philip, led by the Spirit to go.
Yeah, that's the work of the Spirit, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I can't talk about that. I can talk about my journey where the Lord led me out of places of comfort and familiarity into places that were deeply difficult and awkward and challenging, places where I didn't get any of my cultural needs met. And I really...
Can you, hang on, just
sure.
Can you define cultural needs?
Cultural needs...
People are going to hear that and go, I don't know what Geno's talking about.
So cultural needs, it's interesting. Whenever I'm talking about this or teaching on this or preaching on this, people of color may have never heard that expression. I never heard it until I started saying it. They know exactly what I mean when I say cultural needs. Yeah. There is this deep amen that happens. They know exactly what I mean. But when your cultural needs are met, like you don't think about them, right? So cultural needs, I would describe as, we talk about culture as things that, music, what you find funny, food, right? Culture, right? Yeah. And so most people in their native space naturally get their cultural needs met. You have all this context with these people, and so you only have to say half the joke because you get the rest of it. Yeah. You make a Seinfeld reference, and anybody who watches that program, like they know the episode you're talking about, or Friends, or if you're talking about Black shows, Martin, or Sanford and Son, or the Jeffersons, right? Yeah. And there's high context, right? Yes. And so it's even true with music. So much of music and flavors of music and the arts are signed or native to certain cultures, right? Yeah. And so when you go, as a Black person, you go to a white church, the music is going to reflect the dominant culture there. The preacher, if he's white and he, lived the homogeneous life, his illustrations, the way he unpacks the text or she unpacks the text, his illustrations, his story, the humor he uses, will come.
And all of that happens without thinking.
It's without thinking. Particularly if you're in the dominant culture, you never have to think about others or the other, right? And so if you're a minority like me, come into a space like that, the music is already set. The preacher's preaching a certain way. There's a vibe in the room that I have to do a whole lot of thinking. This is why it's so challenging for people of color in white spaces, because what do we want as pastors people to do when they come to our church? We want them to connect with a message. We want them to connect with worship, and we want them to connect in community, right? So when none of the things are culturally familiar to you, there are sometimes dozens of hurdles to jump over before I can connect with the message. I mean, just the visual of the room, and I'm the only person here. Is like, man, am I welcome here?
Yeah.
You know,
And you've had these experiences.
oh, many times.
Yeah.
And so I know what that feels like.
Those weren't your experiences young, but then you come to college and that's when you start having these experiences.
That's when I started having those experiences.
Yeah.
And so being in touch with that really started to birth, what I call a holy discontent.
Yeah.
It wasn't probably that holy at the beginning,
Yeah.
but I just felt like I have more language for it now, but I was like, man, it cost me a lot to be here. It cost me a lot to be here, and nobody seemed interested in changing it. I mean, people would mention it, this, that, and the other, but nobody seemed to be actively doing anything about it. So I felt the Lord say to me one time, it wasn't like an audible voice, but it was like, hey, when you start your church, make sure it's not that way. And that was actually my call to church planting.
Okay.
Because guys like Jeff Heidkamp and Tony Renvesto had gone out before me to plant churches out of the Urbana Vineyard.
Yeah.
And I just felt like the Lord says, hey, I'm calling you to create a vineyard space. Since you know what it's like to be the other, you know what it's like to not have your cultural needs met. He was actively calling me to build something from scratch that had that vineyard DNA, but also had a deep value for welcoming large cross-section of people.
Well, and Geno, I have another question that sort of ties into that.
Mm-hmm.
So you grow up in the Black church.
Yep.
All Black friends, all Black school. Then you go to college, lots of white space. You go to Urbana Vineyard,
Mm-hmm.
predominantly white culture space.
Mm-hmm.
You're quote unquote giving up a lot to be here,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you feel like this is your people. Because
Yeah.
that's what's interesting to me.
It was
That's
interesting.
very interesting to me. I'm surprised. I guess what I want to ask is, why didn't you just tap out and go to another African American church?
That's a good question, man. And there were times where I felt like, again, I have better language for it now. I felt like I was, I don't know, losing myself. And I would come home and my dad would like, you talk differently, or just certain signs that suggested that, hey, this white space I'm in is having an impact on me that I was maybe unable to perceive and unpack, and still maybe not to this day, but I liked the vineyard. I liked the organizational structure of it. I really immediately connected with the values of the vineyard, the simplicity.
Like what values?
Oh man, I liked. I'll tell you, when I first visited the Urbana Vineyard, I saw Happy Lehman from across the room, and I knew he was the senior pastor. He just had a certain swagger.
Yeah.
And my father had a just sort of authority, just he had presence, right? And so I recognized the senior pastor, and I thought to myself, I bet that's the head guy. But at the same time, super accessible.
Yeah.
People didn't seem to take themselves too seriously. I went back to the church during the week, and Ben Hare, who was the executive pastor at the time, Ben was like spray painting a podium, and he was straightening chairs, and I was like, this big church, like these pastors are like picking up paper off the floor, and
yeah, they're doing the regular stuff.
No, my parents pastored a small church, so my parents didn't carry themselves like big deals. But I've been in enough churches and enough spaces, not just Black ones, where the pastor had his own parking spot. Like he was a super important guy. He was whisked into back rooms, and I really connected. Something within me connected with how accessible I could get a meeting with these guys. I would see them picking up paper off the floor.
Yeah,
I was like, man, these guys walk in authority of their office, but they're just regular guys,
Yeah,
and
this is actually one of those things that's touched my heart because I've done a ton of stuff in the vineyard and then a ton of stuff out of the vineyard, and you're putting your finger on it. Like Phil and Jan are the most sweet and accessible people.
Yeah.
Like I just see them so love on people, and they're our national directors, right?
Yeah.
Every time they're in rooms, they're just open, conversational, affectionate, present.
Yep.
And I've been in other movements or in other moments that were definitely not that. I think I can see that. That means something.
Sure. And we're talking about my wiring too, because as I get older and can think more broadly about these things, certainly more so than I was when I was 20 or 21. I understand that there are things about the Black church that I just didn't love, but I appreciate and understand. When you go all the way back to slavery and all the way back to, you know, those terrible times for our people, man, the black church and the black preacher was the only slice of dignity in those communities. And so, you know, the preacher being revered and the preacher having his own space and a nice car. I mean, this was the only person in the community who was revered, even by the slave masters. And so some of the things that from the outside, people look at the black church, that seems like extravagances or just sort of senseless things. They have deep roots, cultural roots and meaning. So I'm not demonizing anything. I'm just talking about what I was drawn to,
Sure.
and the type of pastor I wanted to be.
And all of that makes sense.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, completely.
And so that, along with the worship too, man, because I had been listening to some Vineyard worship before I found the Vineyard, and I didn't even know that Vineyard worship was connected to but the year before I came to the Vineyard for the first time, I went to the Urbana conference, back when it was still in Urbana.
Yeah.
And they had this really diverse worship team, and I kid you not, they played almost the whole Hungry record.
Yeah.
Hungry, you know, There's No One Like Our God, Breathe. They played almost that whole record. That was a part of the songs. And I was so undone at that conference. And so when I came to the Vineyard, they were playing a lot of those songs, and I would just be a mess. Every Sunday I would come to Vineyard and I would just weep. I would weep during the worship.
Yeah, that's amazing, because on the one hand, many of your cultural needs are not met, but then beyond that, there's something of the Spirit that's at work in your life.
Yeah. And so you asked me why I stayed, and I get that question a lot. I first met Jay Pathak. He was like, "Hey, man, so how'd the Vineyard get you?" You know?
Yeah.
But it was I felt at home in a sense, but at times I felt not at home, you know?
Yeah.
But I definitely felt called to the Vineyard, which is why I didn't leave. But in terms, when I think about cultural needs, I would go over to a Black church in town on Wednesday nights.
Yeah.
Because I just needed to hear a Black preacher. I needed to hear some Black songs and be in the company of Black church folks. And so I would have to get my cultural needs met someplace else, but I would still consider myself at home in the Vineyard.
Wow. And so this is really how God began to work a very specific vocation and calling into your life.
Very specific. Mm-hmm.
It's amazing, because here you are now, you're in the South Suburbs and you have a diverse church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, maybe at 19, you didn't know that was in your heart, but God began to cultivate something in you. Yeah.
Pastor Turner from Liberty Temple, church we grew up in, he would say often, typically the things that bugs you the most about the world is usually what God is calling you to fix about the world, or, you know, usually your calling is
to.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't have any models, but surely we can get different kinds of people in the room.
Yeah.
Right. Now I didn't realize how hard that would be.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something that.
Well, and Geno, I would also imagine, because you just said you didn't imagine how hard it would be to get different kinds of people in the room.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I went to a Cubs game last night with Ted.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but there is something about church, and I'm imagining, and maybe I'm wrong here, but maybe part of the difficulty is churches come along, and you got white church, you got Black church, you got Korean church, and so we could all kind of just like go to our own little silos, right? I don't have to do the hard work, right? And so that may be another one of those boundaries.
It is, because you think about, you mentioned baseball, when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, people had to get over their racial hatred, but they realized he was a great player, and it did wonders for the game, right?
Yeah.
Church is different. You come to a diverse church, you got to give up a lot of your cultural snacks. If it is thoroughly diverse, you got to give up a lot of your cultural snacks as it relates to how you like the message delivered, how you like music, and, you know, you got to talk about race. You got to deal with the social issues of the day.
Yeah.
You got to deal with, you know, all sorts of fragility and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's unlike going to something like a baseball game. You're coming into a community where you spend a lot of time and invest a lot of your energy, bring your kids to. And so there's a lot more invested in the church community than, say, going to observe a baseball game.
Yeah.
So that's where the challenges comes in.
Yeah. So what have you not just learned, because I hear a lot of that already, but what have you sort of distilled from this journey that Jesus has been taking you on that has informed the way that you lead your church here?
So much, man. I feel like
were you talking about this stuff, like when you planted the church, were you like day one, we're going to be a diverse community?
absolutely, because you have to, part of what has made this work, again, I didn't have any models, I didn't hear any podcasts on this, but what I thought from the beginning was, hey, we'll have a better chance doing this if we have a multi-ethnic team and if we move to a multicultural, multi-ethnic city or collection of cities. And not just a multicultural city, but a multicultural city that likes that about itself. Because sometimes the way things shake out with gentrification and white flight and all, people are stuck places where they can't move, but they would move if they. And so you have a diverse space that's segregated and people don't like that about the community. We wanted to find a place that that's what they put on their website.
Yeah.
We the village of Homewood, we the village of Prosper are a diverse community. And so that's what we found here. So those two pieces. And what's happened is from day one, you have this diverse community of people who end up being your first ring of leaders. They are actively speaking into what we do on a day-to-day basis. They're shaping our vision. They're shaping our mission. They're actually they're executing that with you.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that when you were putting your team together, you on purpose, even at the granular level of your initial team,
absolutely,
you're saying, I got to have some of everything.
As much as we can get.
Yeah.
And I mean, it took me 3 years to build that team of 13, which all those people are still with me here as we are at year 10.
They're bought in.
Sure. And people, I guess, ask why people haven't left like they typically do. And to that, I would say it's a miracle of grace and God's kindness toward me. But it's also that we are still on the same mission that we were. There has been any dramatic shifts in the mission. We have the same vision statement. We're still trying to be diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural, Jesus-loving people who.
How many years have you been doing this?
This is 10 years.
Okay. All right. So Geno, you're at 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
You got a building. It's a great place.
Thank you.
Yeah. As you reflect on it, what would you say to pastors in particular? Maybe even more than we might have to pick up worship at another time. Let's just talk about pastors here for a second. What would you say to pastors who are thinking, I'm listening to this and I'm resonating with it. I don't know what to do. Our church is essentially one culture. What do I do?
Well, before I answer you, I'll say this. I used to not have an appreciation for the homogeneous church. I do now. That is to say that I believe that there are certain communities, certain realities, certain demographic spaces where the homogeneous church is the best. For example, where there's a language barrier.
Lavinia makes tons of sense, doesn't it?
It makes tons of sense. The other thing is, since white culture is such the dominant culture, there are people who go to work and everything they do, they go to school, all these sorts of things in totally white spaces. And what they need most what their soul needs is on Sunday to worship in their cultural and native space. And so I have an appreciation for those spaces now that I didn't necessarily 10 years ago when I started this church. I thought everybody should be That's just not practical, and for many, many reasons. That aside, I feel like the key to moving to a place of meaningful diversity is you have to decenter. In the Vineyard's case, there's a decentering of whiteness that has to happen, right?
What does that mean?
It means that if whiteness and white supremacy, which some people, when I say white supremacy, they hear it as, Klan with
KKK.
white sheets. I'm just saying white being normal, white
Yeah.
being right, everything else being
Yeah. So you're
an
not
interesting
saying
one.
KKK. You're
I'm
saying
not.
something much more
saying,
nuanced.
Sure, I'm saying if the Vineyard doesn't decenter whiteness from how it thinks about ministry, how it preaches, how it does music, how it does, everybody who's different than white will have to come into somebody's else's center. And so I spent over a decade before I planted this church with whiteness at the center of my faith experience. And that is a lot to ask of somebody. And only few people who feel called to a movement, who feel called to be almost a missionary of sorts, will agree to do that. My faith experience, my pastoral reality is much different because I lead in a thoroughly multi-ethnic church. I get plenty of my cultural needs met here, although not all of them, just because there's no ethnicity that is at the center of what we do here. And now I'm a Black pastor, right?
Sure.
And so
you bring that with you every day.
I bring that with me every day, but I have also been baptized in multi-ethnicity. And so I've honed a style, and I'm very intentional about every word I preach, every word I post on social media. You have to be very intentional because we have a very broad constituency, if you to use that expression,
of course.
Right? So the decentering of any particular dominant ethnic reality is what's necessary if you want a truly multi-ethnic space. You won't do that perfectly, but the effort is going to make move the needle, I think.
Well, and I'm hearing a question in that I'm sure you get all the time. I'm hearing people who are listening to this going, okay, we're going to decenter whiteness, but not just decenter whiteness. We're going to decenter any particular ethnicity from being the normative expression of who we are, what we do, right? And I'm wondering, gosh, Geno, does that mean that none of us can be happy? Like how does that work, right?
Well, I don't think. I hear your question, but there is so much happiness in this. There is so much fruitfulness.
Talk to me about that.
Here's the thing: you live in a multi-ethnic community like we live. We have a multi-ethnic church.
Yeah,
it's messy, it's clunky, it's uncomfortable. You don't get all your snacks, but it's healthy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, chocolate's good, chips are good, right?
It'll kill you.
If you just feast on that one thing, like you're not getting all of the stuff that you're supposed to be getting, right?
Yeah.
And so while you take great delight in eating one type of thing, you are a healthier, happier person when you are feasting on all of the food groups. Does it make sense?
Yeah, of course.
And so, Phil says it all the time, God doesn't give anybody everything. And basically, the big part of this conversation with Better Together and the diversity initiatives is to awaken us to this reality that we've left a lot of money on the table. We aren't having the experience that we could be having because there are so many of our brothers and sisters who are not at the table yet.
Yeah.
And, people are so preoccupied with what they have to give up and what they lose. They're not really focusing on what they could have, right? And so I think part of my job and my ministry is to be a voice for that in the Vineyard. And what I've discovered lately, man, is like, if you're not making somebody mad, then you're not doing this right. You're not doing the because in this, man, Black people think you're selling out. Sure. White people think you just need to chill out, because you're talking about white fragility, you're talking about white supremacy, you're talking about racism and all these things. They just feel like, hey, man, just chill out. It doesn't take all that. I'm not a racist. I'm not in the Klan. I'm not burning crime. Right. And it's like, it's deeper than that. It's deeper than that. And so we're getting into places, and even in the Vineyard, where there's resistance and, there are people that aren't crazy about this message. But I mean, that's a sign that,
Oftentimes the work of the Spirit does that, though, doesn't it?
Sure. Especially in this realm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm even thinking of the passage where the angel of the Lord shows up and says, actually, I'm not with you guys or you guys. you guys can be with me,
Yeah.
you know? And it's kind of that thing, right? Like oftentimes the work of the Spirit is doing that thing where we're all finding those little bumps in our heart where we're uncomfortable again.
Mm-hmm. But you know the beauty of this. There's the beautiful side of this, and there's the really challenging side. The beautiful thing about this is that we, through Vineyard Soul Records, we through having diverse leadership at the national board level and having our national conferences be thoroughly we are providing for people what I longed to see and experience.
Yeah, I think about how much it's moved in the last 7 years.
Right.
Right?
And so what this means for people of color in the vineyard who have wondered if things would ever change, if they would ever be seen, if there's a place for them here. And so you get all these, we start doing the soul records and Better Together. All of a sudden we unearth all of these creatives, Tina Williams and Joshua Mill. I mean, and these people are some of the best in the vineyard.
They're some of the best anywhere.
Sure.
Yeah,
And-
I'll put it that way.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then different speakers who can, and pastoral in all areas, all of a sudden, there's a home for us now in the vineyard. We're not just having to put up with things. We're actually having some things at the table that we want to eat and we want to be a part of, right?
Well, right now, Melissa and I have been working on just putting together worship for our 2 national gatherings, you know? And what's awesome is one of the things we think about when we're putting together the bands and the leaders is diversity. That's like a thing we think about.
Yeah.
But what's great, Geno, is that we have options.
We do.
You know, it's not like I'm hunting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not looking for a diamond in the rough somewhere.
Right.
They've come to the surface and it's very obvious. And then I was even telling you this off microphone a few moments ago. We've got like these top line diverse leaders, but now because of some of the things that you and Casey and others have done, there's this other layer of leadership that's beginning to percolate up. I speak for a living. It's coming out of the ground, and it's like younger, diverse leadership is beginning to show itself, and we're going to see some of that this summer. But then in 5 years, this thing is growing.
Yep. But here's the thing, man. When you think of all the players, right? These people didn't just come to the vineyard. We had to actively give them space. Some people had to decrease so that these minority voices could increase. Some people didn't get worship leader opportunities so that right? And so in the last 5 years, particularly, I credit Phil Stroud as just to listening well and being humble and saying, hey, tell me how this looks from your perspective. What do you think we can go? And I didn't agree with me on everything, right? But he made some space for people like me and some of these creatives, and what that does not only for our movement, but it does something. Because I always say, our conferences, our CDs that we put out, or now singles or whatever, they are a window for people to come and peek into the vineyard.
That's it.
So if somebody would have peeked into the vineyard, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, a person like me, and they didn't feel a call to the vineyard, they would peek in, they'd come to a conference and they go, well, nothing here for me to do, right? They would look at vineyard worship and go, nothing here for me, right?
Yeah.
Now, if they peek now, after 2 soul records,
Looks very different.
it looks very different. And so these are the first fruits of what we're trying to produce. Now, I said there's a challenge to this. The challenge is, it is a mostly white movement. And some very well-worn paths, some very...
Muscle memory.
Sure. And so part of my job and others is to be able to gracefully speak truth to power and to raise an awareness for the centeredness of whiteness, for the centeredness of these cultural preferences that they don't seem, there's nothing sinister or there's nothing inherently evil about it. It is just an unwillingness to pay, to share the cost of pursuing multi-ethnicity. Currently, in most denominations, the people of color are paying the most to be there. And so the conversation we're trying to have is, why don't we share the expense a little more? Now, we shouldn't be the
when you say share the expense, you mean just giving up all of our cultural norms.
What does it cost you? What does it cost you lately to pursue multi-ethnicity? Now, you ask a person of color like me or some of the others, they will tell you years. They have received, all sorts of costs. I would ask the local senior pastor, every area of ministry, you know, whether it be Multiply, whether it be you leading Vineyard Worship, whether it be a national director, what has it cost you lately to lean into this? And so some would answer, hey, we've done this, it's currently costing me this, great. Others would go, dang, it hasn't cost me a thing in a while, right? And so I feel like where we're going is such a beautiful destination, but it's expensive relationally, expensive with regard to your taste and preferences.
Geno, I think this is important work. This is important work. Hey, could you speak to this maybe as we just wrap this up?
Sure.
People have been listening and they've probably been touched. Is there a resource or two that people could maybe grab hold of and go, maybe I should read this book, or maybe I should listen to this message, or maybe I should engage with this so that I can help think different, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you just give us some recs?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can see that's the second stack of these books that I bought. You see on my bookshelf.
Yeah.
It's a book by Brian Larissa called Insider, Outsider.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is a book that basically talks about.
We'll put this up on our Instagram.
And you can have that copy.
All right. Thank you.
It's a book that talks about Brian Larissa and how he, like many of us, have been sort of, much of our discipleship and spiritual formation happened in white evangelical spaces. For me, that was a Vineyard.
Yeah.
And so there was some unlearning I had to do. And so he challenges people in my position to value the Black church and to value our culture and not just adopt a totally white way of doing things. But he also challenges modern evangelical movement to become more woke and realize that it could do harm to guys like me who come. And so Insider Outsider is a book that I widely recommend.
Yeah,
there's a book I just that I'm reading now by a lady who we're actually going to try to invite to Better Together. Her name is Robin DiAngelo. She wrote a book called White Fragility.
Okay.
And basically the premise of that book is most people are, again, whiteness has been so centralized and people think of racism as these terrible people who burn crosses and lynch people in trees.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for white people to not be fragile around this subject. Most white people don't have to reckon with the realities of racism and stuff like that.
It's just easy to say, I didn't do any of those terrible things.
Exactly.
Get off my case, Geno.
And so the term for that is white fragility, which keeps these deep, meaningful conversations from happening, right? Another important book is a book by Austin Channing Brown. It's called, what is it called? It's called I'm Still Here.
Yeah.
And it just talks about her experience as an African-American woman in all these majority white spaces. I highly recommend that book. And there's several others. But those three,
that's a good reading list.
I've really been informing my speaking and teaching lately. And I think it's definitely worth picking those up.
All right. Want to ask you two more things.
Sure.
One, if the people who are listening to this and are realizing, gosh, I maybe need a little help,
Mm-hmm.
you don't care if somebody emails you, do you?
Not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, if this is, on the Vineyard national website, Vineyard USA, it has all the audio from the last two Better Together. Can I plug the Better Together?
Yeah, of course.
So
You
Better
should.
Together is a conference that we started doing back in 2016. And Better Together is a 3-day conference where we bring in speakers and workshop leaders who talk about diversity from the perspective of sociology, history, the practical pastoral, and it's just chocked full of helpful, spirit-filled, educational, talks and workshops on this subject of diversity, reconciliation, the multi-ethnic church.
And you're going to have it again next year.
2020 in Evanston, Illinois. It's in the Chicago area from August 11th through the 13th.
That's great.
There'll be more information about that. But all the audio from those sessions are on the Vineyard National website, or you can get them through the Vineyard digital Vineyard membership. So,
Yep. If you're listening to this, Geno's a great resource.
sure.
I'd encourage everybody
And reach out to me.
I would encourage people to reach out to Geno because he's a trusted guide. All right, Geno, one more question. This is what we ask everybody at the end of the podcast. Tell me about a time you experienced great joy.
Time where I experienced great joy. I have 4 boys.
I do know that.
And I mean,
They're good-looking kids. I'm looking at a picture of them right
They're
now.
all right. They're all right. Well, I'm a good-looking guy. So
That's it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
man.
that's it.
And so I just have so much fun with them. So I don't know if you're talking about a specific moment, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, we get so much time together, man. I've been so fortunate in pastoring this church. I've also been able to be a stay-at-home dad for them. And so as the kids have come through, I've been able to spend a lot of time with them. And so my oldest is 11, then 8, then 5, then Zeke, the baby, is 2. And so these guys are so silly, and they're so they have so much personality, and they get humor, and they joke with me, and we go to the football field and throw the ball. And my greatest areas of joy and consolation come from them, rolling on the floor with them and wrestling and playing sports with them. And so God has really used them to be a source of energy and joy for me, and to get to do that with Shannon, my wife, is something that we really
I can
enjoy,
see it.
especially through the summer months. So I think that.
Yeah, I
Do I
can
only
see
get
it.
one?
Have another. There's no rules here. This is my podcast. Have another.
I find myself, I'm really in my happy place, man, when I get to play music with some of my dear friends like Joshua Miller and Tina Williams.
Can you
Every
think of a-
now and then
Can you think of a specific
I
time?
can think of specific moment. We were at the Diverse Leaders Gathering recently in Minnesota.
Yeah, I wasn't there. I heard it was ridiculous.
It was ridiculous, and it wasn't an ideal. I'm kind of a snob when it comes to sound and audio, and we didn't have a stage. We were in a room,
Yeah.
bunched together, but we had such a great experience. My cultural needs are so met by Josh Miller and Tina Williams, and Leon was playing bass, and we had some other guys playing and singing with us, and it was just such a really enriching experience for me, and it was a prophetic picture in many ways of what's in store for Vineyard worship,
Yeah. I mean, your cultural needs are getting met, and you're inside of your Vineyard family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we were playing songs, just gospel songs, but we were also playing Vineyard songs that
Amen.
fit in that soul space. And I just thought, man, we've come a long way. And so talk about deep joy and gladness, man. That's definitely a moment for me. Recent moment for me.
Okay. I'm gonna throw one thing on here.
Go ahead.
I'm breaking a rule
Go
here.
for it, man.
But it's my podcast.
It's your podcast.
Whatever.
Do it.
Yeah. Speaking of songs, and
Mhm.
even in that moment, I just have to plug a song here.
Okay.
And if you want to call this like heavy-handed, that's fine. Dude, Generous God is so good.
Thank you, man.
It is so good. I was on the call with both the worship leaders who are going to lead in Denver and in Dayton.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, hey, here's a, like, we put together a list of songs. Like,
Mhm.
here's a bunch of Vineyard songs. Here's some non-Vineyard songs. Like, let's keep this our song universe so that we are repeating songs and so that people can join in worship,
Mhm.
right? And I'm like, let me highlight just a few songs for you. And one of the first ones I highlighted both places was Generous God, because that song moves rooms. So if you're listening to this and you don't know what it is, look at the Vineyard Soul record, find Generous God, and you need to do it at your church. Even if you go, I don't have a soul church. It doesn't
don't
matter.
need-
Like
you
this
don't need it.
song,
Yeah.
song transcends a genre.
Yeah. And it just was translated to Spanish. So there's
There you go.
Spanish now. So that
Yeah.
was a lot of fun to write with my friend D. Wilson.
Yeah.
And the musicians we had on the soul record just made it come alive. So
Yeah, no, that song is sick
Yeah.
though. I mean, for me, it's more than the recording. It's something else. Yeah.
it is. It's special.
Oh.
So thanks, man. That's high
Yeah.
praise.
We'll take it. Geno, thank you for just doing this. Thanks for sharing an hour with me. Thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks for
And,
having me.
Thanks for doing the work you're doing.
Glad to do it, man.
All right, everybody. Listen, you need to dig in here. Go and check out everything that Geno's up to. Look at the Better Together conference. That'll be at the end, well, not the end of year, at the end of next year in August. Hope you'll be there. This is important work. Peace, everybody.
Hi, everyone. This is Melissa Keller, Events Director for Vineyard Worship. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I've got a couple of ways you could really help us. First of all, review the podcast on iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Also, connect with us on social media, Instagram at the Ferment Podcast and Twitter at FermentCast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.